Okay, so we're just going to have a quick look at a 6-step process in terms of writing learning intentions. No way of working is always linear, but it does provide a way of working, and it does enable you to make sure that you're covering all the steps that you actually need to. So, in order to write learning intentions, we must always start with the task. Absolutely always. We need to know what students have to learn to do and what they need to know. So, what students know and can do. So, we must define the task first. And of course, as I keep saying, context, genre, audience, and purpose are critical components. So, once we've done that, we can determine the skills and knowledge that students need. And of course, we want students to be successful, so we need to be mindful of that. And when we map these out in detail, it makes us far more efficient and far more precise in our teaching and learning. It becomes more targeted. Third step, once we've determined the skills and the knowledge, and I'll show you how to do that, we map it out so we can clearly see it. And we want a sequence. And we want it to be cohesive and thorough. So once we've got a sequence, we can then develop some learning experiences. Which then go into lesson plans. Okay, once we've done that, we really need to go back to the source, back to the principles or guidelines that we need to be working with, and that's the Australian curriculum. So we go and have a look at the achievement standards. And we do a quick check and a little bit of an audit. Are we on track? Is what we're asking of students fair and reasonable? Most likely it will be. Step 5. Once we've done that, we're on the web page. We access the content descriptions. And why do we do that? Well, we need to devise very clear learning intentions and success criteria for each lesson plan. That means we need to understand exactly what the content descriptions are. They are an excellent starting point to focus in on those skills and knowledge needed for students. Once we've done that, we can build specific learning experiences. And that's all about teaching students about those requirements or components of each of those content descriptions. If we do that, we are going to be thorough in our planning. Students are going to know what they need to do, when, how, and why. And we're going to have students, hopefully, that are feeling confident about the assessment. Okay, so how we've already established that we need to actually have an example task before we go any further, because that provides us with the criteria that we need. We're going to look at a scenario, a particular assessment task, before we look at learning intentions. So basically, I'm modelling the process for you. Now, I've already said we need a genre, and that's provided in the rationale. So in this particular instance, Year 8 students are going to be producing a rationale. That's the genre. But what exactly do they have to do? Well, we're going to be reading a whole range of short stories. What they have to do is, from that range, select. So they're going to be reading lots of short stories, and they're going to choose 2 most likely with a theme. They will then decide how and why those two stories should be included in an anthology. What's, again, our 4 critical components: audience, genre, context, and purpose are all interconnected. But these why, students need to go through this process themselves. So what's the point? Why would they include 2 stories in an anthology? Takes a lot of thought, actually. It's higher order thinking. So I guess they need to choose the context, what their focus is going to be. Is it going to be mental illness? Is it going to be gender equality? Maybe it's a focus on strong female characters. Maybe it's about self-esteem issues in young people. These are the questions that students need to ask themselves and make some decisions about. Once they've determined exactly what the context is for themselves, although the context generally overall is about the role of short stories, the role of fiction in understanding the world and making sense of a particular issue, it might be, or a way of helping people. So it's a role of fiction, which is basically a main reason that we explore this particular form of writing. It's an escape, but it does encourage critical reflection about life and who we are as individuals. So once a student has a pretty good idea of what their context is going to be within this larger context of the assessment instrument, they need to look at audience and purpose. So what do they want to achieve? Do they want to help young people cope with self-esteem issues? And if they do want to do that, then what would a likely audience be? Perhaps it would be an anthology for a shelter for troubled adolescents. Maybe an audience would be those who would attend Oprah Winfrey's show. Perhaps they would likely be women of a particular age, but this will need to be researched. Maybe it's a church leader writing for his parishioners. Maybe he wants to create an anthology. Notice how these two are really tightly connected. Everything is really. It's a very messy, interconnected spiral, which is why you need all 4. So maybe it's a church leader wanting to write an anthology focusing on mental illness for the youth group in the church. Maybe the student wants to be an eccentric professor writing for a group of university students. Or maybe it's a published author showing a group of struggling writers how to group short stories into a particular theme. I mean, it could actually be the student choosing to be themselves and writing for their own age group. There are lots of ways. It might be a doctor wanting to create an anthology and explain why he wants these particular stories in an anthology for his medical practice. Might be the perfect place, a coffee table, where he knows that people with mental illness are going to be arriving, and whilst they're waiting for an appointment, a worthwhile experience would be to read some of these stories. So these are the sort of things that we're looking at. So again, step 1, develop an example task. Okay, so we're just going to unpack that assessment task just a little more. Key components that students need to think about. Well, yes, it's a reflective assessment. Yes, there are elements of persuasion, and yes, there are elements of information. The student needs to be able to combine all 3. But really what we want them to do is look at the representations in each story they're focusing on. Is it a focus on race, social customs, gender, and some of those other ones I've already touched on. But they need to know exactly what they're going to be looking at. What are their personal reasons for wanting to include the two stories? That really taps into the meaning and relevancy for each student, and we want them to be thinking about that. So phrasing some questions along these lines would help them unpack this. What are the positives and negatives of the stories? They need to be able to critically examine those stories to see strengths and weaknesses and how that actually fits with their purpose. Creates much deeper analysis and reasoning. So they also need to think about cultural reasons about why they should or shouldn't be included. Always at the core of everything we do is empathy for others and a sensitivity towards other human beings. So again, choosing wisely, but being acutely aware of the impact that we can have in the text that we create. And remember, the ultimate aim of this assessment is to create an anthology of short stories. So another thing that we want students to be thinking about is the story's value to other people. They've thought about it in terms of themselves, their personal reasons, which is here. What about other people? Because they're putting it together for them, so it's good to step out of the picture and look at it holistically. Another aspect to all this is what aspects of the genre for each short story is so compelling or ordinary. Is there an exciting climax? Characters? Characters really are very important in fiction. What about sharp dialogue? Evocative descriptions of scenery? Maybe there's insightful reported thought by the characters. Maybe theme, etc. As you can see, we've broken it down and tried to make it very clear to the students. Another factor they want to consider is, are they going to use third person, first person? They will definitely be using present tense, and the preference would be third person because there's not an intimate connection with the reader in this case. It's a justification about why these short stories should be included. Okay, we're going to be looking now at step 2, which is determining skills and knowledge. Absolutely critical for obvious reasons. Essentially, students need to know their purpose and the purpose of the task and the purpose of the entire unit. So let's have a look at this. Obviously, we want them to be successful. So now we get down, we're drilling down deeper. So if you think of a massive umbrella, and in here, it's understanding short stories in terms of structure, language, audience, and positioning. So they need to be able to evaluate texts for their worth, and they need to achieve their ultimate purpose, which is either position audiences to accept their two stories because they want to assist people with mental illness, or they want to inspire young women, or motivate women in domestic violence situations, if that's what the stories are about, to escape. So we have a massive umbrella here, and it's going to get quite long because there are quite a lot of things required for students to be successful in this particular task. So really, I'm just going to draw some circles, and this is probably going to get a little bit messy, I'm afraid, but underneath that umbrella, they need to learn about, students need to learn about vocabulary, what to use. They need to look at aesthetic features. And both of these things come under language features in the Australian curriculum. And examples would be alliteration. The list is massive, as you would probably be aware. Antithesis, similes, oxymorons, and the list goes on and on. So, students need to be able to identify them, explain them, determine the effect that they will have on audiences, and unpack the meaning. So there's a lot in just that one skill or knowledge required for students to be successful in this task. Another one is learning how to recognise short stories that have value, particularly in relation to their chosen purpose and their chosen audience. Recognise worth and be able to articulate that. So we need to teach them how to do that, which is closely connected to learning intentions. So a church congregation will expect different things to a group of rock music fans, for example. They need to be able to articulate that. So let's have a look at some of these other things we need to teach or include in our lesson plan. They need to interpret. We'll extend our umbrella. Interpret. Note that cognition, interpret. You'll see that in the Australian cognition. Interpret texts and be able to unpack the meaning within it. For example, maybe the short story includes strong female characters that inspire women to keep fighting for equality. Or maybe it carries a warning about the dangers of domestic abuse, which might be suitable perhaps for young women in certain circumstances. So that's one. There are other components as well. They need to learn how to write formally and correctly in analytical paragraphs. So analytical writing needs to be taught. What else do they need? They need to learn about grammar. In this particular context, spelling and punctuation, which, as I said in week 1, needs to be explicitly taught and used in this particular context. What else do students need? They need to be able to persuade and inform readers about the worth of their chosen texts. They want the readers to accept their logic and their reasoning about their choice of stories. Now, this is just a sample. We'll finish the umbrella here, but we've got some key aspects that are now creating a framework for our learning experiences that will be occurring within our lesson plans, which will inform our learning intentions based on the content descriptions in the Australian curriculum. Okay, so we've done steps 1 and 2. Now we're looking at step 3, which is mapping the knowledge and skills into a sequence into lesson plans. Now it's pretty rough at this stage. It's just a working draft, and you'll find that you'll tweak it and shape it if this was a real series of lesson plans that you were going to be creating for students. Step 4 is about checking the Australian Curriculum Achievement Standards and making sure that we're on track. And I've got the website up here. Unfortunately, it's not crystal clear like it was a second ago. I'm not sure why that is. Please bear with me. But it'll be good enough for our purposes. Basically, this is just an audit, making sure we aren't asking students to do anything beyond what is required at that level of Year 8. Now, we don't have to do all of it. This is really just checking to see what we are covering. So I'll highlight it as we go. So receptive modes, what are students being asked to do? It's an anthology, a rationale. By the end of Year 8, students understand the section of text structures is influenced by the selection of language mode and how this varies for different purposes and audiences. Well, they're certainly thinking about different purposes and audiences. We established that with those 4 critical components which is why you want to make sure they're embedded in your task. Will students be explaining language features? Yes, they absolutely will. And how they represent different ideas and issues in texts. Absolutely. That's how they're going to be looking at the value of the text and the meaning that is made within those texts and why those texts are suitable for a certain group of students or people. In a church congregation, for example, maybe a youth group for young people, then the students are going to have to select stories that are appropriate and aren't going to be offensive. And they're going to be able to have to unpack some of the vocabulary and imagery and characters that are being used and why they are absolutely pertinent for helping those students, those youth group members in a particular way. Students interpret text, questioning the reliability of sources of ideas and information. They are absolutely interpreting the texts. We used that cognition earlier when we were looking at their knowledge and skills. And they are looking at ideas and information within the texts. They select evidence from the text to show how events, situations, and people can be represented from different viewpoints. Well, they could be, they're definitely looking at how events, situations, and people can be represented. They might be looking at female characters and how powerful they are. And they will say that this is an important female character for these particular women or young female teenagers need to explore and think about. And they will be looking for different emphases in texts. Okay, so in the receptive mode, there's a fair bit being covered. In the productive mode, speaking, writing, creating, let's look at that one. Students understand how the selection of language features can be used for particular purposes and effects. They are acutely aware of that because they are creating their own effect and they've got their own purpose in mind. So they are going to use language that makes that come about. I'm not going to say the short story is not appropriate for the anthology when that's the very purpose. They explain the effectiveness of language choices they make to influence the audience. Well, in this case, they're not actually explaining their own use of language choices. They're actually using language choices to influence the audience. They want them to accept their reasoning that these short stories are actually appropriate. And they will be, well, let's look at this, combining ideas, images, and language features from other texts. Yes, they're referring to the short stories, and they'll be incorporating quotes from those texts to show how ideas can be expressed. Students are creating texts, and they are selecting language to influence the audience response. They make presentations. Well, in this case, it's a rationale. And we're not really assessing the active participation in class. When creating and editing text to create specific effects, students take into account intended purposes, absolutely always, and the needs and interests of audiences. Yes, they're not going to put completely irrelevant things in there. They demonstrate understanding of grammar, select vocabulary for effect, and use accurate spelling and punctuation. Absolutely they will. And we have already established that we need to explicitly teach those skills. All right, so that's step 4. So now we're at step 5, which is all about looking at the content descriptions to devise learning intentions and success criteria for each lesson plan. So now we're drilling right down into the minutiae. So it's important that we understand and are familiar with these content descriptions in the Australian curriculum. So it's definitely worthwhile exploring the website. Do it when you've got a bit of spare time, maybe on the train, on the bus. But the content descriptions that I want to have a look at are in the literature strand. And I'm interested in devising a lesson plan with learning intentions about the skill and knowledge needed to unpack meaning within the text based on the aesthetic features. So when I'm looking at examining literature, sorry about that, I need to... Okay, so we're looking at the examining literature, very important part of the English classroom. And we want to identify and evaluate, note those cognitions. It's always good to have a dictionary handy, or of course the glossary. The Australian curriculum actually has a lot of inbuilt glossaries. What does evaluate mean? It means make a judgment. What does identify mean? Well, be able to spot. So identifier is a lower cognition than evaluate, which is in a much higher area of the hierarchy of thinking, and it has a higher cognitive load on the brain. Obviously, it's easier to identify than it is to evaluate, but our students need to be able to do this according to the Australian curriculum. So they need to be able to evaluate devices, rhetorical questions, repetition, all those sorts of things that create tone. So a short story will have a tone, poems have a tone, novels have a tone, and so on. But we want them to be able to look at the wordplay, innuendo, any of these things. And of course, at the moment, we're looking at drama, we're looking at short stories. So that's a content descriptor that would be relevant in a lesson plan. The other one that I think that goes really nicely with that, although you could have lesson plans devoted to each of these, one each, or you could combine them, it depends on you. But we've got another cognition here, interpret. So cognition is a verb, it's a skill, something students do. And we've also got analyze. So far we've got identify, evaluate, interpret, and analyze. Those 4 cognitions are going to have to be taught in a lesson plan if we choose to do that, if we choose to combine them in our learning intentions. So don't make your learning intentions too big. Scope and scale is very important. Always try and work within the time that you have been given to do it well. Keep it simple, do it well. Provide enough detail, not too much detail. Otherwise, the bell will go and you won't have done what you've wanted to do. So students are looking at language choices. They're looking at sentence patterns. There might be parallel sentences. There might be lots of short sentences. And that's particularly useful in short stories to create momentum and suspense. Short, sharp, rapid-firing sentences arouse tension in the reader, and students might want to talk about that in terms of its appropriateness for creating suspense about an important issue. It might be domestic violence. They might want to focus in on how effective that short story is in creating a sense of fear. The dialogue that the characters use. Why do they use it? Imagery and other language features like sibilance, euphemisms, paradox, irony, flashbacks, all those sorts of things. Climaxes, resolutions, and those sorts of things. So we've now decided that we've got 2 content descriptors that we'd like to work with in which to build learning intentions. So we'll have a look at that. Okay, so now we're at the final stage of developing learning intentions and success criteria. So I suggest that you review Jill's lecture, so hopefully it's fresh in your mind, and follow the pattern that I've provided and that Jill has suggested. So in the forefronts of our mind, of course, are the content descriptions that we just talked about. Now, key cognitions are very important and they need to be explicitly taught. What does identify mean? What does it look like? What does evaluate mean? It's basically making a judgment. Now the content descriptors, identify and evaluate, are going together. We talked a little bit about that previously. And we've got interpret and analyze. So you've got the low level mingling with the higher level, which is a form of inbuilt scaffolding, I guess you could say. So in order to write some learning intentions, we're going to keep very much in mind those 2 content descriptions. Effectively, we know that students have to identify learning intention 1. Students have to identify. There's our cognition, which we're going to unpack in the lesson. Devices that create tone in short stories. In fact, I'll circle that one. That's a learning intention. Students evaluate their effectiveness and how tone is being used. There's another learning intention. Now, why? Well, students need to know this so they can talk about the strengths of these features in their rationale to convince their readers that their reasoning is sound. The same occurs, effectively, we've got learning intention 2 here. Now, make sure you don't develop too many learning intentions because you'll blow out your time and you won't get through them. I'm modelling ways of using content descriptions here, so I'm not overly worried about that. I just want to model at this stage. So again, we've got these really important cognitions. I can't stress these enough. Students interpret how language features. It's not complicated, is it? In short stories, we're contextualizing it for the assessment task, which is why we need to know what it is in the first place. Positioning audiences. In order to determine the meaning and worth of it to a particular audience. Example, a student might interpret the language in a short story which creates a theme that may be supportive of drug use, and as a result would therefore not be deemed appropriate for a audience of youth group members attending church who might actually be struggling with drug addiction. So we need to teach students how to interpret those language features. And again, I really think that you shouldn't be interpreting without analysing, and that's the other content descriptor. Really, when you think about it, despite having 4 learning intentions, again, they're so interconnected that you're doing them simultaneously, but you do need to teach them explicitly. So students analyse the language features. And as above, you just change the words to suit. So that is basically how you derive learning intentions. Very important. Focuses your thoughts and your thinking, and certainly puts students' attention where it needs to be. Now all you need to do is work out exactly how you're going to teach students to identify, evaluate, interpret, and analyse. Very important cognitions in the English classroom. Now, success criteria are written based on those learning intentions. So you just change the language. Students will know they are successful if they can evaluate 2 or 3 language features in short stories and be able to analyse how they are positioning audiences. And again, all the learning intentions, the success criteria are linked to the learning experiences in the lesson plan, which are then linked to the assessment instrument, which is why we started there at the very beginning. And that's it.